The top of the hour. Good morning to those of you just joining us. It is 9 a.m. on June 21st. This is Fox and Friends. Just moments ago, Vice President J.D. Vance meeting with leaders from Qatar and Pakistan in Lucerne, Switzerland, as peace talks are underway. Chief Foreign Correspondent Trey Yingst is live in Tel Aviv with some breaking news and reaction. Hi, Trey.
Yeah, hey guys, good morning. I just spoke with President Trump for more than 20 minutes, and he gave some new insight and reaction about the ongoing talks that are taking place in Switzerland and the threats coming from the Iranian regime. President Trump telling Fox News that the U.S. may take over the strait in the future if they have to and collect tolls. The president described this as the United States being the guardian angel of the Strait of Hormuz and the Middle East. And the president said ultimately that would involve the U.S. taking 20% of the oil that passes through the strait. Remember, this comes in reaction to the Iranians saying they will close the Strait of Hormuz in response to Israeli strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon. President Trump tells Fox News he spoke with Iranian officials overnight and said, you close it and you won't have a country. He went on to tell these officials, you won't even make it back to your effing country. Now, earlier today, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian said this about Iranian enrichment of uranium. The president also reacting to that. Take a listen.
We will not give up our right to enrichment, and they, too, will be forced to accept it. You all know what the so-called President of the United States was saying. He had made a complete 100-degree turn. He was saying that Iran must surrender unconditionally. Iran has no right to do this, it has no right to do that.
President Trump, during our call, responded directly to those comments by Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. President Trump told Fox News he better watch his mouth, he better shape up, or we'll take over the rest of the country. And so clearly the president reacting directly to these comments from Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian. And also President Trump talked about the broader memorandum of understanding, indicating this is just a ceasefire extension. This is not the final deal with the Iranian regime. And the president says he holds the cards and maintains a variety of options if the Iranians don't make these serious commitments at the negotiating table. He said, I have a 60-day option, and I can do whatever I want after that option. So again, President Trump leaving a variety of considerations on the table and says that the United States could become the guardian angel of the Strait of Hormuz and collect tolls itself while taking oil, around 20%, the president says. As it relates to oil, President Trump also said that 19 million barrels of crude oil exited the Persian Gulf yesterday as a result of this memorandum of understanding with the Iranians. Guys?
So, Trey, as always, a fascinating report and fascinating interview you just had with President Trump. When he says something like the United States will be the guardian angel of the Strait of Hormuz and that the United States reserves the option of taking 20% of the oil that passes through there, is that a message as much to Iran as it is to other world leaders around the globe that you need to participate in this and help us make sure that the strait remains open to the free passage of oil?
Yeah, absolutely. Because remember, during Operation Epic Fury, President Trump called on these other countries to get involved because the United States uses just a few percentage points of its oil that actually comes out of the Persian Gulf. And these other countries didn't want to get directly involved in securing this critical international waterway. It was only after the fact that they actually were offering to help and send military reinforcements. It was the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy specifically, that put that significant economic pressure on the Iranian regime by closing Iranian ports. They were losing hundreds of millions of dollars every day. And again, this is what they consider their leverage. Because they lost so much on the battlefield, they are looking again to the Strait of Hormuz. And that is why you heard that statement from Iran's IRGC overnight, threatening to close the strait in response to Israeli strikes against Hezbollah and Lebanon. And again, President Trump tells Fox News he told Iranian officials directly, you close it and you won't have a country. Now, I also asked the president about the situation in southern Lebanon and the exchange of fire between Israel and Hezbollah. Remember, 5 IDF soldiers were killed over the weekend by Hezbollah. The Israelis responded with a series of airstrikes across southern Lebanon. The president told me he is disappointed Israel can't put Hezbollah away. He went on to say they can't do anything without knocking buildings down, and that he is close to giving it to Syria. And he is talking about empowering Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara to actually go into southern Lebanon and fight Hezbollah, because the president believes that he would do a more precise job in terms of the way he would deal with Hezbollah, not knocking down buildings, but fighting them on the ground. And so, again, the president expressed what we had heard from President Trump just a week ago, his frustration, or better put, his disappointment with the Israelis and the way that they are fighting Hezbollah. Remember, 5 IDF soldiers were killed over the weekend by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon.
Right.
But again, when we zoom out here, there's a lot on the table.
Yeah.
And the president also spoke about the situation in Gaza. He said at this moment, Hamas is not causing a lot of problems in Gaza, and that the process needs to play out with the ceasefire agreement there. And that he says the focus should be on the agreement with Iran, because once Iran is taken care of, many of these other issues will fall into place. Guys?
Yeah, the president, based on what you're telling me, clearly sending a very strong message to Israel, saying it's too brutal the way you're handling it. I think an al-Qaeda guy can do it better, more precisely than you. Not a good look for Israel, for sure, in this. We had on the president earlier, Herzog from Israel, who spoke with Griff, and he said, he promised that they had no territorial ambitions in Lebanon, or specifically in southern Lebanon, which would indicate that when this is over, they're going to return the land back to the Lebanese who have been displaced there. Now, we just saw J.D. Vance very diplomatically handling things in Lucerne, Switzerland, and then your conversation with the president, a lot more aggressive. Is this a case of good cop, bad cop?
I would say that the president is looking at the reality on the ground. And when the Iranians are making statements about closing the Strait of Hormuz, first of all, we know that that's propaganda, because international shipping data indicates that many vessels are still passing through the Strait of Hormuz, this critical waterway. But the president clearly, he told Fox News, wanted to send a direct message to Iranian officials, even telling those officials, you won't even make it back to your country if you close the Strait of Hormuz. I think it's also important to note the fact that so much oil actually made it out yesterday, 19 million barrels, according to President Trump. That's a very significant number, and an indication that there are still vessels leaving the Persian Gulf. And this is not talking specifically about Iranian ports. We're talking about these Gulf countries, allies of the United States. And the president said there was such a backlog of oil that it's now gushing out of the Persian Gulf. And you think about just how still things were in this region, and now that it is open again, these vessels can actually export this oil. But I think really an important point here is what the president is leaving on the table as it relates to the Strait of Hormuz. He says, we may take over the strait if we have to. I'll blow the S out of them. And he is talking about the fact that if the Iranians try to close the Strait of Hormuz, not only will the U.S. open the strait, they'll take control of the strait and be the guardian angels of the Strait of Hormuz and the Middle East, and then ultimately take a percentage of the oil that is passing through. And again, this is an indication that President Trump is signaling to the Iranians that are currently at the table in Switzerland, make these concessions about your nuclear program, adhere to the memorandum of understanding, or there would be serious consequences that would actually reverse what they are trying to do, saying that if they don't make a deal, we'll collect tolls, the United States of America.
Right, but let me drill, Trey, quickly into exactly what Rachel is talking about, the look of a good cop, bad cop, because when Iran's president, Pezeshkian, said that Iran will maintain the right to enrich uranium, it flies in the face of the entire goal that Vice President Vance just laid out on camera at historic, first time ever in history, Iran and the U.S. meeting at a high level, and Vance saying that if Iran will abandon their nuclear ambition, then they will receive a fundamentally different relationship with the U.S. Does President Trump even have a, he pretty much has to tell the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, that he should watch his mouth because he's threatening to derail this on the eve of it actually happening.
Yeah, President Trump actually left open the concept of a civilian enrichment program in the future for Iran. But remember, they're working out the details of Iran's nuclear program that includes that buried, highly enriched uranium around 60%, but also the rest of the program. And again, President Trump responding directly to the comments from Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. I actually read him the text of what President Pezeshkian said, and he responded saying he better watch his mouth, he better shape up, or we'll take over the rest of the country. And so, again, the president wants to keep things on course here as it relates to these conversations that are taking place in Switzerland today. And the next phase in all of this is the detailed discussions about Iran's nuclear program. It is a 60-day window. And a lot of people have commented on this agreement and expressed opinions about what it means. We have to look at the facts on the ground here. And again, according to President Trump, the man who signed the Memorandum of Understanding, this is just an option. He says, I have a 60-day option, and I can do whatever I want after that option. Clearly, President Trump leaving both diplomatic and military options on the table if the Iranians don't adhere to their end of the agreement.
All right. Trey Yingst, great reporting, great getting a call in with the president and bringing us up to speed. We'll continue to follow this. Trey, thanks.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.